Alrighty, chat. So, apologies for the slight delay. Welcome to another stream. My name is Alok Kanoja. I'm a psychiatrist practicing in Boston. Just a reminder, everything we discuss today on stream is intended to be for educational purposes only, and nothing is intended to be taken as medical advice. This is doubly true for today because we're going to be talking some about ADHD and depression. So if you guys have concerns, questions, we'll talk about this a little bit more. Please go see a licensed professional. So a couple of things, just a quick reminder that we are launching parent coaching. So we're trying to support parents to improve their relationship with their kids, support their kids through video game addiction, And we're going to be launching those spots on November 11th, so it's 8 days away. And y'all can sign up here if you are parents. Couple of other things. So we're going to have some stuff relating to parents. So like I think a lot of people will ask, how do I deal with my parents? Parents will ask, how do I deal with my kids? So we're going to have some of that stuff kind of coming down the pipeline. I think we've got one potential question today. We may have an interview on Friday. I don't know exactly what's going on next week. But today, we are going to try to do something very challenging. So I'm going to teach y'all a little bit about the relationship between ADHD and depression. And I have to say, this is one of the most difficult lectures that I've had to prepare. So that I'm going to need y'all to like cut me some slack, first of all. So I don't know if this is going to be too much or too little. We're going to span a lot of different stuff. So we're going to talk about genetics. We're going to talk about neuroscience. We're going to talk about developmental psychology. We're going to talk about sort of the manifestation in the present of depression and ADHD and like how that looks. So basically what I want to do today is share with you guys the narrative of ADHD and depression. So what are the genetics? What happens in your brain? What changes in your brain result in cognitive changes or behavioral changes within a person? How do those changes within the person affect their development through life? And then what does that look like in the present? Like where do we end up once you have a genetic change, a neuroscientific change, a developmental consequence, and then you're kind of in the present? And then the question is going to be like, sort of the next question is like, now that we understand how we got here and what our current situation is, what we can do about it. So this is challenging as an educator because like it's going to involve so many different disciplines of science and even like a little, not so much on the spirituality, but like psychology and therapy and things like that. So I don't know if it's going to be too much information. I don't know if y'all are going to be able to follow along. So the one thing that I need is the ability to redo this lecture in the future if it kind of implodes. One thing though that I've started to really appreciate is that the internet is full of like really, really smart and engaged people. And so one thing that we're trying to do at Healthy Gamer, which we're sort of committed to, is like not dumbing things down. So it's my firm belief that, the better you understand the situation, even if it's like hard to understand, the more equipped you're going to be to actually make a positive impact in your life. Okay. So, and then if we have time, we'll touch on a couple of Reddit posts. So I'm estimating this lecture to take somewhere between 30 and 45 minutes, just so y'all know. Where it's going to be quite dense. And so it's possible it'll like end up with an hour, especially if we get to questions and things like that. So let's start by talking about ADHD and depression. So the first thing to understand about ADHD and depression, let me do an outline. So we're going to talk about what we understand about genetics, okay? And this is the other thing that I have to tell you guys. At many points throughout this lecture, because this is science, and I'm presenting it as such, y'all may feel like, oh my God, does this mean I'm screwed? I have ADHD, I have depression. Does that mean like because of my genetics and the genetics are so bad that we're screwed? No, you're not screwed just because of anything that we talk about here. Even though it sounds like the evidence I'm going to present is going to be quite compelling, the statistics are going to be quite shocking, and at the same time, you're not screwed. So don't worry about it, okay? I'll kind of explain why. So we're going to start off by looking at genetics. Then what we're going to do is sort of look at how our genetics manifest as particular changes in our brain. What are the different circuits in our brain that deal with ADHD and depression? And specifically, what are the circuits in our brain that result in an interaction between these two diseases, okay? Once we sort of understand the neuroscience of the brain of someone with ADHD and depression, what we're going to end up with is understanding a set of cognitive deficits. Right? So what is like the practical consequence? Sure, I'm going to be talking about things like brain volume and different circuits in the brain and stuff like that. But practically, how does that translate into particular deficits? Once we understand the deficits, then what we're going to do is take a look at development. So if we take someone who has these particular manifested deficits, how does their life evolve and what kind of circumstances and experiences do they have as a result of those deficits? And once we understand development, then what we can do is look at the present. So now that we understand the developmental arc, what does that result in today? Like, what are you dealing with today, and what are the consequences of the development? Okay? So like in the present, what are your symptoms? What does your life look like? Right? So this is like what we're going to cite research at every step of the way. So if we do a cross-sectional analysis, if you guys know what that means, on people with ADHD and depression, what do we find? So cross-sectional, for those that don't know, is like research that basically is about one point in time in the present, okay? And so if we like take a snapshot of people with ADHD and depression, what do we discover about their lives and their situations? And then the next thing is that once we understand like all of these different things, and we understand, okay, what are the deficits, what's going on in the brain, what's the developmental impact, what do you face like in the here and now, trying to put together a roadmap to address our problems. So like once we understand the complexity that is like ADHD and depression, can all of this information essentially give us some kind of roadmap forward? Y'all ready for this? Is this good? Okay, we'll get to a lot of what you guys are talking about. Okay, so let's start with genetics. What do we know about the genetics of ADHD and depression? So the first thing is that twin studies. So there's a great paper in 2019 by Ferrone and Larson, show essentially a 70% concordance with ADHD and depression. So what that sort of suggests is that there's a very tight link between, there's a genetic root that manifests as both ADHD and depression. So like twin studies are actually quite compelling here, that like there's something going on in the genes. So if you look at genes, that there's a 70% concordance between these two things. And so we'll get to how this is related and you know how you manifest as both. But it does appear that there's essentially like a very, very tight genetic link in terms of ADHD and depression. Now, for those of you that are kind of, so this is the first point of hopelessness, okay? There are going to be several points of hopelessness, and I'm going to try to address each of them in turn. So if I were to say that there's a high genetic correlation between ADHD and depression, what a lot of people will conclude is that if I've got the bad genes, if I got unlucky in the genetic lottery, basically I'm screwed for life. But the truth of the matter is, as a clinician, that's absolutely not the case. So this is what I want y'all to understand about like the relationship between genetics and how it manifests in an individual. So I think about genetics as a vulnerability or a potential. And generally speaking, what we understand from psychiatry, and this is clinical medicine, okay? So this isn't like genetic studies, this is like looking at real human beings, is that genetics plus environment equals illness. So essentially what's going on is genetics is sort of like your vulnerability or the probability of something going on. And then when you combine that with particular experiences, if that formula doesn't go well, you end up with illness, okay? So for example, some people may be genetically predisposed to trauma. So they have like a 50%, risk of trauma. And then depending on what kind of experience they have, let's say they grow up, in Central Africa where there's like a lot of, genocide and other bad things, then that'll result in something like PTSD. And so there may be people with like 25% risk or 75% risk. And so depending on like, what the other traumatic experiences, let's say this is like you're in the Holocaust, so then you end up with PTSD. And let's say even this person is like, had a mom who never gave them like no bedtime stories. And this can result in PTSD. So you guys see, like, basically genetics doesn't determine, it's not a destiny. It's a vulnerability that combined with a particular experience can result in the manifestation of an illness. Okay? So like the other way that I kind of think about this, just to use a quick analogy, is I kind of think about like the genetic vulnerability as like a seed. Okay? So like genetics is like a seed. And then depending on what kind of soil you plant the seed in, and this is where the experience is like the soil. depending on what kind of soil you plant the seed in, it can result in a plant or not a plant, right? So if my soil is like concrete and I take this seed and I try to plant it in concrete, it's never going to grow. So like a concrete soil is sort of like what I think of as like, let's say a monk, right? Because they're so control of their mind. They're in such strong control of their mind that like even genetic vulnerabilities can be kind of like overcome. Compared to if I take, even a seed that's not very robust and not very healthy, and I plant it in super fertile soil, like growing up in an environment where you have parents that are like abusive and emotionally neglectful, even the weakest seed when grown in the most fertile soil will manifest in a plant. And so then people are saying, well, okay, like I know what the next, point of hopelessness is. Oh, I have a genetic vulnerability. I have a family history of like whatever. And I grew up in an unhealthy environment. Does that mean that I'm basically screwed? And the answer is still no, because remember that through experiences, you can actually change the soil, right? So this continues to be malleable. So even if you have genetic vulnerabilities to particular things, by changing your environment, by changing your relationships, you can still escape the destiny that negative genetics will offer you. Does that make sense, chat? We understand that? So going back to ADHD, so there does seem to be, in depression, there does seem to be a strong genetic concordance between ADHD and depression. If you drew the short end of the stick, or if you drew the short straw, doesn't mean you're screwed, okay? A couple of other things to note about the genetics and sort of correlation between ADHD and depression. So this is quite alarming. So ADHD increases your risk of depression by 5-fold. Okay? So it's like an increased risk. It's crazy. By 5-fold. So if you take a group of, if you take 100 kids, and 50 of them have ADHD, and 50 of them have no ADHD, the likelihood of depression is 5 times higher in the ADHD crowd compared to the non-ADHD crowd. Even more alarming is there's a 500% basically increase in suicidal ideation for people who have ADHD. There's also a 3x risk of completed suicide. This is staggering. Okay? So people who have ADHD are three times the increased risk of actually committing suicide. Okay? So there's like a lot of stuff going on here which may relate back to genetics. We'll talk about this stuff a little bit more later, right? So for example, we know that suicidality, usually completed suicide is not like a long and planned thing. So there have been studies done where basically we examine people who attempted suicide. And for some reason or another, we were able to save their life. And then we ask them, when did you make the decision to try to kill yourself? And movies and media will portray suicide as like a long and thought out kind of thing, right? We'll sort of think like, I'm going to put my affairs in order. I'm going to write a bunch of notes and I'm going to do all this stuff. And I'm going to order the favorite thing for like, I'm going to order presents for the next 5 Christmases for my kids because I won't be around to order them, right? So people like, there's this idea that we put our affairs in order, but somewhere between 60 and 80% of people, the decision to try to kill yourself happens within 5 minutes of the attempt. So it's a very impulsive decision. And so if we look at ADHD we know increases your impulsivity. We'll get to that in a second. And so we can see how if you have a brain that is more likely to be vulnerable to impulsive decisions, you will actually increase your risk of suicide. Does that make sense? So we'll kind of go into this more. So this is kind of a quick result of, looking at sort of genetics and what are sort of the epidemiologic factors, what are the risk factors, and what can we sort of expect about the connection between ADHD and depression from a statistical level. The other interesting thing about this is that treatment of ADHD reduces depression symptoms by 20%. So it appears that treating ADHD actually has a therapeutic impact on depression. So once again, what we're seeing here through the twin studies, through this stuff, and through this stuff, is that these are not two separate diseases that some people are afflicted, right? This is the main point that I'm trying to make. This is what you need to understand, is that we may classify ADHD and depression as completely separate illnesses. But when I work with people as a clinician, and when we look at sort of the science and the statistics around it, what it seems is that there's a common process that manifests as both ADHD and depression. So it's not like really two separate diseases. It's like there's some sort of common root that manifests with these two constructs that are sort of societally made. Okay? So now let's look at, okay, so let's say that I have, these genetic changes. Okay, so I've got a set of particular alleles that make me predisposed to depression and ADHD. So let's try to understand what's going on in the brain of people who have this genetic vulnerability. So we're going to talk about a couple of different circuits of the brain, okay? So this is like my terrible drawing of a brain. So here's a brain, okay? So over here, we have the amygdala, okay? So this is kind of interesting. So the amygdala is responsible for the experience of negative emotions. It's also our survival center of the brain. So this is where we experience things like fear and sort of anxiety and things like that, okay? We also have like the insula, which is kind of around here, which is also relates to negative emotions. So a lot of our emotional circuitry is kind of in this central part of the brain, okay? There are a couple of other sort of things that I want to talk about. This is the nucleus accumbens. So this is a major part of reward circuitry. So the nucleus accumbens is a dopaminergic area of the brain, which means that it's like it sort of governs behavior and reward. So probably actually a little bit close, more to the right, which I guess I can fix later. And then there are going to be a couple of other parts of the brain that we're going to talk about. One is the orbitofrontal cortex, or OFC. So this involves the regulation of emotion. Okay? So like what I mean by this is, I don't know if you guys have had this experience, but like sometimes we get emotional and we can logically try to talk ourselves out of it, right? We can sort of like use logic or our control circuits of the brain. These are our emotional impulses over here. Okay? So these over here are our emotional impulses. And this is where our control comes from, if that sort of makes sense. Okay? And this is where, if we look at this thing over here, this is where we sort of get the nucleus accumbens will govern a lot of our behavior. So we'll kind of get to that in a second. Okay? The other thing, the other part of the brain that we're going to kind of talk about is the dorsolateral PFC, okay? And this also has to do with emotion regulation. Or emotional control, I would say, as opposed to regulation. We'll talk a little bit about how those are different, okay? And then the other thing that's kind of important is that, like, there are connections between these parts of the brain. And those are important too. So, like, we're going to talk about the anterior cingulate cortex, okay? So this mediates talk between our emotions and our control functions. Okay, you guys with the neuroscience? So like basically there's this thing called the ACC, which is here, which basically is the circuit that allows these two guys to talk to these folks over here. So this is sort of a basic, we'll kind of talk about, what the changes are in a second. So this is what we see in people who have ADHD. The first thing is that we have the volume of amygdala and insula is smaller than controls. Okay? So what this means is like these parts of our brain are actually smaller. There's like a decreased volume. So they have small emotional circuits. Okay, now this is kind of interesting because some people may hypothesize, they may say, well, if our like emotional parts of our brain are like smaller, doesn't that mean we experience less emotion? And it turns out that the opposite is true. That if you look at, how can I say this? That volume of amygdala is inversely correlated with depression. So the smaller your amygdala is, the more likely you are to experience depression. For people who have large emotional circuits, just based on raw brain volume, they are actually less likely to experience depression. Okay? Now, the next thing that's important to understand is, so you guys get this? Y'all got that? So what that basically means is that like small amygdala and insula, which is what we see in ADHD, results in a greater vulnerability to the experience of depression. The second thing that's really, really interesting is that the nucleus accumbens of people with ADHD is different. And the main thing that's different about the nucleus accumbens is that our emotional circuitry has a large positive effect on our nucleus accumbens. So what does that mean? So this means that people with ADHD, the influence of their emotions on their behavior is stronger than the influence of emotions on behavior in a normal brain. Okay? So what that means is that people with ADHD, their behaviors are vulnerable to emotion. Okay? Does that make sense? So generally speaking, our nucleus accumbens like gets all kinds of different like projections, right? So what'll happen is like there'll be an influence from our emotions, there'll be an influence from our frontal lobes, there may be even like influences from like, let's say our linguistic cortex, not linguistic, lingual, gustatory, that's the word I'm looking for. So this is our ability to taste, for example, like that can have influences on like reward and behavior, right? So we get all kinds of like stuff that goes into the nucleus accumbens. And basically like our brain has this constant calculation of like, should I do this behavior? Is this rewarding or not rewarding? And so like you can have things like taste, right? Like your cortices are like, oh, I shouldn't eat that because I'm trying to lose weight. And then like your amygdala is like, I've had a bad day. I just went through a breakup. Screw it. We're just going to eat a tub of ice cream. So that's like literally like the experience of a human being can be mapped onto the nucleus accumbens in the way that these different parts of the brain sort of interact with them. So when we look at the brain of someone with ADHD, the amygdala and insula are going to have stronger impacts on the nucleus accumbens, which may also, so if we kind of look at like what is the result of that, what this means if we take like amygdala and then plus nucleus accumbens in the brain of ADHD, what we get is impulsive behavior and emotional behavior. You guys see that? Like how the more I'm controlled by, actually, let me put it this way. The more I'm controlled by my emotions, the more impulsive I'm going to seem. My behaviors will be more impulsive. Do y'all get that? So we can kind of see that the phenotype or the manifestation of ADHD, of impulsivity, may come from this neuroscientific interaction. So now we're going to get to this in a second, but we can see how the symptoms of ADHD are the experience of someone with ADHD, their impulsivity, which is not like a neuroscientific thing. There's no like impulsivity circuit of the brain. I mean, there may be a circuit, but impulsivity can't be mapped to a neuroscientific structure. What we can map to a neuroscientific structure is the integration of all these different things to the nucleus accumbens. And based on the way that those circuits integrate into the nucleus accumbens, we can have impulsive behavior or we can have non-impulsive behavior. Another example of that is that when we have a very strong frontal control of our nucleus accumbens, we will result in less impulsive behavior. Okay? So now we can see that, like, we can sort of start to see where impulsivity and especially emotional decision-making kind of with people with ADHD come from. Okay? The next thing that we're going to talk about is in ADHD, unfortunately, there appears to be a weak connection over here, okay? There's a weak connection over here, and so like this, the anterior cingulate cortex in people with ADHD is weak. And so what that means is that the ability for our cortical brain, which is like emotional control, regulation of emotion, and most importantly, this circuit that allows the connection between our control circuits and our emotional circuits seems to be weak. And so since it's weak, our ability to kind of regulate our emotions or put the brakes on emotions seems to be negatively impacted. So these are the functions that we call top-down control. So this is deficient in people who have ADHD. What top-down control means is like you can have impulses within you. So I have like an impulse, right? Which I don't really control. It's just an impulse. And then there's like my brain over here, which is kind of suppressing it. It's like, oh man, I really want to eat French fries. And then my brain is like, no, we're not going to eat French fries. We're going to eat a salad. So that top-down control comes from the frontal lobes. And this part appears to be deficient in ADHD. So this can also result in impulsivity. You guys see that? So this is kind of like a quick summary, okay? So let's go over it from the top. And then we're sort of setting ourselves up to understand the neuroscience and how this will manifest as symptoms of ADHD. So the first thing to understand is that, let's pick purple. Okay. So the first thing is that the brain volume of the amygdala and the insula in people with ADHD is small. What this sort of results in is essentially like our ability to, how can I say this? So we know that these regions of the brain being small correlate with worse depression. Okay, so let's just accept that. Let's not try to understand how that works for a second. The second thing is that we have our control circuits of the brain, which seem to be less connected to emotions. So what that means is our ability to put the brakes on our emotions has gone down. So this is also mediated through the ACC. And lastly, we have the nucleus accumbens, which essentially determines what we do. And what we see in the nucleus accumbens of people with ADHD is that it's very sensitive to emotions. And less sensitive to top-down control. Y'all with me? Right? So the experience of emotions influences your behavior. Your ability to put the brakes on that is harder. And then this is the key thing about reward circuitry. What that means is that like in your brain, I know it sounds kind of weird, but it's not conscious, but there is greater reinforcement from emotional decisions. I know it sounds kind of bizarre, but like what that means is if we kind of think about the behavioral reinforcement, the dopaminergic circuit that actually drives your behavior and creates your motivation, all of your motivational hardwiring in your brain, all of your motivation in your brain that gets hardwired is going to be more shaped by like emotional decisions. So it's kind of really challenging, okay? So now what we're going to do is get to the deficits. So this is what happened. So researchers did a bunch of studies, and essentially what they did is they looked at, okay, what are the factors in ADHD? So if we take a group of people with ADHD and depression, what are the factors that we can sort of conclude correlate with these two things? Right? So what this essentially do is they take a group of people with ADHD and depression, they take a group of normal people, and they explore, okay, what is the impact of having ADHD and depression? So this is essentially what they discovered. So the first thing is that there is emotional regulation deficits. And I know this may seem common sense at this point, or like, duh, right? Didn't we just explain that? But I want y'all to understand these are different kinds of studies, right? So this is like, these are brain scans where they're just scanning people's brain and they don't know anything about the people's symptoms or their experiences of life. And these are like asking people questions about, okay, are you depressed? Why are you depressed? And then they track that down to their individual experience. So this is like individual experiences. And this is like brain scans, right? So these are different kinds of data. So we're trying to weave them together. Now, hopefully at this point, you guys are saying, well, duh, this is obvious. And that's the whole point of the lecture, is to try to integrate these different kinds of research so we can get a better understanding. The second thing is people with ADHD and depression are more irritable. And irritability is its own biological and neuroscientific thing, okay? We'll talk about what emotional dysregulation means. Let me see. So actually, let's define emotional regulation right now. So it is the ability to identify and modify. Get ready to get wrecked, chat. Emotional states that promote adaptive and goal-directed behavior. Okay? Right? So this is kind of damning for a lot of us. So this is a quick side note. So in our coaching program, we've had somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 people, maybe 7,000 now. And so we're doing a massive study on our coaching program. And what we find in our coaching program is that we see a 20 to 40% reduction in depression or anxiety, despite the fact that our coaching program is not treatment for depression or anxiety. So how is it that coaching can actually improve symptoms that we're not trying to improve at all? We're not qualified, we're not trained, we're not mental health professionals. So it turns out that our running hypothesis, which we're actually studying right now, is that we believe that coaching actually improves EQ, or emotional quotient. It improves our emotional regulation. It improves our ability to identify and modify emotional states that promote adaptive and goal-directed behavior. That's what coaching is about. It's about goal-directed behavior and sort of taking what you are on the inside and sort of like adapting it, shaping it so that it results in like motivation and goal-directed behavior. So anyway, that's what emotional regulation is. So the other things that they found was that people with ADHD and depression have discordant relationships. So there's discord within the relationships. They found peer victimization. It's a fancy way of saying bullying. And then they found academic hardship. Okay? So when we look at like people with ADHD and depression, what we essentially find is like people are trying to figure out, okay, like what are the common elements? What is the tie between ADHD and depression? And these are the 5 things that they found. They found that people with ADHD and depression have poor emotional regulation. They're highly irritable. And what we can actually see is that there are a couple of other things, and that we find discordant relationships, peer victimization like bullying, and like academic hardship. So let's try to understand this a little bit better, okay? So how can ADHD and depression result in these things, right? So let's try to link our neuroscience to these things. And then how can these in turn lead to depression down the road? So now there's a really interesting point of research here, okay? So this point of research is that ADHD, I forget exactly, leads to like 50 to 70% depression. But depression leads to 2.7% of ADHD. So what does this mean? This means when you take a young child with ADHD, when they grow up to be an adult, there's like a 50% chance they're going to have depression. But if you take a young child with depression, there's a 2.7% chance that they're going to have ADHD. Okay? So what it actually means is that ADHD appears to be a causal factor for adult depression, but depression does not appear to be a causal factor for ADHD. So this is a really, really important point to understand. What this means is that if everything was purely genetic, okay, and if everything was just like in the brain, then these numbers should be the same. But what this suggests is that there's a developmental component here that growing up with ADHD leads to depression. And this is really important for us because this is a point of hope. If this was just pure genetics and these numbers were exactly the same, forget about the fact that they're like so far apart, right? Like 50% versus 3%. That's a huge difference. What this means is that there's something here that we can actually intervene on. You guys get this? Okay, so now let's try to understand, how does ADHD early in life result in depression later in life? So remember that what if we kind of look at ADHD, we have impulsivity, inattention, okay, irritability, dopamine reward sensitivity, and poor emotional regulation. The other thing that we sort of know is that people with ADHD, their frontal lobes mature more slowly. So what that means is like their maturity is going to be less than people of their age. So let's kind of just think about this constellation of symptoms and what growing up as this person looks like or feels like, okay? So the first thing is like, let's talk about, so now what I'm going to actually do is, I didn't do a great job of this, so let me actually think about doing it this way. Okay, what we're going to do, we're going to take these things, okay? We're going to move them over here. No! Screwed. GG. Okay, let's take a look at these three. Now what we're going to do is take these, okay, and we're going to play a little game, chat. So these are the things that we know from, studies contribute to the depression that people with ADHD have. So now let's play a simple game, chat. Let's see if these match up, right? So let's say I'm impulsive. Do you think that will how do you think that'll affect my relationships? Am I more likely to have a discordant relationship if I'm impulsive? Right? Absolutely. Do you think if my irritability, do you think that will negatively impact my relationships? Absolutely. Do you think my inability to attend to situations will negatively impact my relationships? Absolutely. So now we begin to see that, okay, if depression and ADHD is connected through discordant relationships, we can see how these three factors will result in discordant relationships, right? So like, I want you guys to put yourselves in the shoes of like a 13-year-old with ADHD. So let's say I'm like hanging out with my friends, and then like they're all talking about something, and then like my attention wanders. I don't participate in the conversation. So then like, I'm just kind of sitting there, and then I'm impulsive. So I randomly start talking about like zebras. And if there was a cheese named zebra cheese, what kind of stripes would it have? Would it be two kinds of cheeses blended together? And then all my friends like look at me like I'm a weirdo because like I'm not able to attend to the conversation plus impulsivity. And then what ends up happening, so there are studies that show that basically people with ADHD don't participate in conversations in sort of a healthy way. They don't get invited to social things, amongst all kinds of other stuff, right? So we can see that like, and let's not forget about irritability. Like the fact that my brain is more sensitive to being irritable and having a low frustration tolerance makes it hard for me to participate in relationships. Okay? Now let's think about bullying. So let's see. What do you guys think? Do you think that impulsivity makes me more likely to be bullied? Like, absolutely. Right? And why is that? It's because of this. So if my social standing in the school is low because of these kinds of things, that's going to result in me being bullied. So if you talk to people who have ADHD, what you discover is they got bullied unless, you guys know this, chat? Unless they were a class clown. So like what people with ADHD essentially learn how to do is like the only way I can gain social standing is with my inattentiveness and my impulsivity. If I can make other kids laugh, I'm not going to be like bullied. But otherwise, their low social standing, their inability to pay attention makes them like get made fun of even more, right? The fact that they're irritable means like you can get a rise out of an ADHD kid. And since I don't have ADHD and I've got friends, I've got 3 or 4 of my friends, and I'm going to like surround the kid with ADHD and I'm going to bully him. He's going to get pissed and he's going to throw a punch, but the odds are stacked in my favor. So he's screwed, right? Because he's not going to control himself. And that's why I'm going to pick on him if I'm a bully, because I know I can get a rise out of him. Okay? Now let's think about academic hardship. So, impulsivity, does that lead to academic hardship? Yes. Inattention, does that lead to academic hardship? Yes, yes, yes. Okay? Once again, the problem here is that oftentimes ADHD is underdiagnosed in children. It is bizarre because it is the disease that is the most underdiagnosed disease and the most underdiagnosed and the most overdiagnosed disease in my experience. What that means is that a high number of people without ADHD get diagnosed with ADHD because they want Adderall and they're bored at school. So they're like have trouble with attention and someone gives them pills. And it is the most underdiagnosed because a lot of times people will miss diagnoses of ADHD because kids are smart. So the smarter you are, the more you can set up compensatory mechanisms and no one ever realizes you have ADHD. And does irritability lead to academic hardship? Probably, but I think this is a slightly less of a thing. Okay, so now let's think about, so you guys with me? So like we can sort of see, it's kind of interesting because we can see that the factors that studies show are correlated and serve as the link between ADHD and depression can absolutely be attributed to a developmental process because the child is here. And then as the child grows without these being addressed, we end up with an adult who grew up with these experiences. And so now we can see how ADHD in childhood results in adult depression. Y'all see that? So this perfectly mirrors what the research tells us, which is that if you're going this way, there's a 50% chance. And if you're going this way, if you start with depression, you got a 2.7% chance. Y'all get that? Okay. So it does appear that there's a causal link. So the cool thing is that if we can fix these in childhood, not just in childhood, but even in adulthood, what that means is that these things should get better. So as we become professionally more successful, as we engage in healthier relationships, because these problems are not just developmental, right? Because if you're still inattentive and impulsive, like it's going to be harder to engage in relationships. You may still be a social outcast in this day and age. The cool thing is that this is not set in stone. So if we fix this even in adulthood, our relationships will improve and we'll see downstream effects. So now we get to the present. So this was sort of our development, right? And so now we're up to bullet point 5. Okay? And we're going to talk a little bit about what this stuff results in. So there are further studies that sort of look at things like emotional regulation and the emotions of people with ADHD. These are the cross-sectional studies. So these studies, or this conclusion that I'm drawing, is developmental. So this is looking at the lifespan of children as they become adults. Now, if we take a group of adults and we just kind of like look at them in this point in time and we try to figure out what is your experience of life in this moment with ADHD and depression, this is what we discover. That the link between ADHD and depression is primarily due to loneliness, primarily due to emotional regulation deficits and shame. So this is, I'm tacking this on. I didn't find a single paper about that. I'm sure it's out there, but this is just what I've seen. So when we're talking about, what it's like to sit with someone who has ADHD and depression, these are the 3 primary experiences which lead to depression in the present. Okay, now let's try to understand, where do these come from? So loneliness is kind of a no-brainer, right? We know that discordant relationships and bullying, like that's going to lead to loneliness. And by the way, if we also look at correlations between suicidality, you guys remember our 3x risk of suicide? Very, very highly correlated with loneliness. If we look at people who actually attempt suicide and commit suicide, they're very lonely. So now we can even see where the big scale epidemiologic data comes from, because these are psychiatric studies. So this is looking at the treatment of illness in actual patients, like humans, okay? We can see that loneliness comes from a combination of like discordant relationships, bullying, and academic hardship, because you're not good at school, so you don't feel like you're doing a good job. Similarly, bullying and academic hardship will also contribute to shame, right? So like this is the experience of someone with ADHD. So we're going to talk about this for a second. So if I've got ADHD, I grow up and what do people tell me? Oh, Alok, you're so smart. You just need to try harder. I don't know why you just can't be more disciplined. Like, I don't know why you are failing so miserably because you're so smart. Because IQ and ADHD are not correlated, right? And so when a child gets told that, and like a child understands it, so the thing that's even more shameful is not even what the child is told, because I've had lots of patients with ADHD that have very supportive parents, and they're trying to be supportive, right? When they say, oh, you have so much potential, they're trying to be supportive. But what the actual experience is the kid knows. They look around and they see everyone else in their class, and they can sort of tell. They're like, I can do math just as well as the kids around me. Like, I understand mathematics. I'm a smart kid. They look around at all these other people who are just able to sit down and study. And like, I know that if I get engaged and I pay attention, I can learn history, I can learn mathematics. I should be able to understand this stuff just as quickly as everyone else. Or in fact, that's what they discover, is that when they're presented with new information that's interesting, they actually potentially even learn faster than their classmates. But despite all of these observations that they are just as capable as their classmates, they just can't sit down and read a book. And so then they feel like idiots. They're like, there's something fundamentally busted in me. And oddly enough, the higher their IQ is, the more shame they're likely to feel. That's sort of a clinical observation. There's some evidence of that as well. There's this thing called the insight trial, which sort of showed that the greater insight you have into a particular problem, in this case it was a degenerative neurological disease, the greater your suicidality is. So like, it's kind of bizarre, and this is what's super sad about working with a lot of my patients with ADHD, is the smarter they are, the more aware that they are of like how screwed they are, if that sort of makes sense. And if you're like stupid and you kind of don't realize there's a problem, it's sort of like ignorance is bliss. But bizarrely, the most shame is felt by the students who are actually the smartest and the most aware. So when we have loneliness and shame, that's going to kind of result in depression. And then we're also going to have emotional regulation deficits, right? And this kind of goes back to our neuroscience, our amygdala, insula, our anterior cingulate cortex, and all that kind of stuff. So there's some interesting stuff that we can further explore here. So, if we're kind of thinking about, what our process is for fixing this, we're going to tunnel down just a little bit further. And I'm going to kind of dive into emotional regulation, because we talk a lot on stream about loneliness and shame, but a lot of people have questions about, okay, so like, if there's an emotional regulation deficit, like, what does that mean? What do I do about it, right? If I'm unable to identify and modify my internal emotional states to adapt and to direct and to engage in goal-directed behavior, like, what do I do about that? That sounds like devastating, right? That sounds like my problem in a nutshell, is that I can't modify my internal emotional state to like do what I need to do. I know what I need to do, I just can't bring myself to do it. That's another way to put it. So further, researchers tunneled down even further and started to look at emotional regulation and realized that there are 3 strategies that people with, just in general, human beings, but especially people with ADHD will employ to regulate their emotions. So the first is avoidance. So what this means is that we're going to alter our exposure to internally challenging experiences. Okay? So altering our exposure can be external, in a sense, or internal. I don't like this nomenclature great, but it's the best example I have. So an example of an avoidance that's external is like, I'm afraid that I'm going to look stupid at the party, so I'm not going to go to the party. Because I'm afraid I'm going to look stupid. So what they essentially do is they just avoid the situation entirely, okay? There are also cognitive behavioral avoidance strategies as well. Okay, so you may ask, like, what does that mean, a cognitive behavioral avoidance strategy? So this is like where they actually reduce or downplay the internal severity. So this is kind of interesting, but it's sort of like mentally checking out, is what I call it. Right? So this is like when you like mentally, like you kind of avoid something in your mind. It's like if I go to a party and I tell myself, I don't even like these people. So it's like, it's okay if I'm awkward. I don't care about these people anyway. You mentally sort of avoid in your mind, like you use a cognitive avoidance strategy to insulate yourself from some kind of internally challenging experience. It's protective in nature, right? Because if I devalue the other person in my mind, I don't actually have to feel rejected at all. Do you guys get that? So I can avoid going to the party, or in my head, I can mentally check out from the party when I'm there. Now this gets a little bit subtle because there are other emotional regulation strategies. So the next is suppression. So suppression's a little bit different because the emotion is there, but I'm going to squash it down. So you may say, isn't that avoidance? And I'd say no, this is sort of fake it till you make it. And if we kind of look at like, what's the difference between someone who suppresses emotion and someone who's avoidant, is like, the person who suppresses the emotion is still going to go to the party, right? They're just going to take all their anxiety and they're going to shove it way down and they're going to smile. They're going to put on a face and they're going to pretend to have a good time. They're not mentally checked out. They're not like AFK in their head and being like, screw all these guys, right? What they're actually doing is like, there's like an internal struggle. But there is also an internal genuineness or authenticity which they're fighting against. Does this make sense? It's very different, actually. On the inside, it is very, very different. Because the emotion is there. We're not avoiding the emotion. We're just trying to conquer it and fight it. And then the third strategy is reappraisal. So this is where like we have cognitive reframes. Right? So this is like where we do some like heavy cognitive work. This is like what things like therapy will hopefully help you do. Where you start to like work on things and you take that negative emotion and then like you do like, once you sort of have developed some kind of understanding of, for example, if I go to the party and I'm anxious, I can sort of cognitive reframe and sort of realize, oh, like everyone else is just as anxious about what they're wearing as I am about what I'm wearing. No one is really paying attention to what I'm wearing, so I might as well just try to have a good time. If some people end up not liking what I'm wearing, maybe they'll make fun of me, but I'm pretty witty, so I can just make fun of them. It's like not that big of a deal. That's an example of a cognitive reframe. It's kind of like processing stuff, right? Working through it, etc. And what we find in people with ADHD is that so let's say normal human beings, let's call normal people blue, okay? So if we have normal people, they'll do like a third, a third, a third. People with ADHD will do like 9/10, maybe 1/10, 0/10. Maybe it's a bit brutal, okay? And then you have people who are like monks, right? So monks, like there's a scale. So like after you've gotten someone who's like, done a lot of internal work or is a monk, they'll do like 1 out of 10 avoidance, maybe 4 out of 10 suppression, and 5 out of 10 reappraisal. And then at some point you've got, so over time, like I think you can kind of move in this direction as you do like more emotional work. Okay. And like super high EQ will be like 9/10 reappraisal, if that makes sense. So we can kind of see that all humans will use all of these strategies, but there's evidence that people with ADHD employ avoidance the most, and that avoidance is probably the most damaging, right? So mentally checking out is a big problem in our community. What's less of a problem, but is still a problem, is like internal struggle or internal conflict. And this is sort of like mental peace. So these are 3 different strategies that we can sort of employ for emotional regulation. Okay? So I know it sounds kind of weird, but if you're someone who's got ADHD, what you probably want to do is move from avoidance to suppression first, and then eventually move towards reappraisal. But it's okay to like feel bad and kind of force yourself through it. And that's why people will say like fake it till you make it, right? It's not mentally checking out. It's like acknowledging that you feel bad and then forcing yourself to do something. So now we move on to the last step. Okay, so just to kind of cover what we've covered, we started with genetics, we started with epidemiology. What are the statistics around ADHD and depression? Then we talked a little bit about different structures of the brain and how, if we look at like do MRI scans or brain scans of people with like ADHD and depression, what do we discover about their brain and how is it different? Once we understood the neuroscientific deficits, we went on to look at, what does that manifest as? What does that look like in someone's life? So what are the vulnerabilities or what are the psychological disadvantages that they have? Then we sort of looked at how being born or growing up with those disadvantages affects your development and how that sort of results in depression later in life. Then we looked at in the present, what does it look like if you're someone who's had ADHD and depression? What does it look like in the present to be in your situation? And then the last thing that we're going to look at now is a roadmap. Okay? So now everyone's wondering, what do I do about this? How do I fix this? And the short answer is like, there's a lot to do. And you're not going to get an answer in the next 5 minutes of how to transform your life. But this is what I will say. So the first thing that I want y'all to appreciate, now I'm going to talk purely from a clinical perspective. So now I'm going to talk about like, as a human being who is a psychiatrist, who works with people with ADHD and depression, here is what I've learned about what works for them. The first is that there is a diagnostic, there's a diagnostic lack of sophistication. So what I mean by that is if we kind of look at all of these scales of problems, right? Like we can take a look at all of the things we've discussed. So is your problem one of like reward circuitry? Is your problem one of, orbitofrontal control? Is your problem one where your amygdala is too hyperactive? Or is your problem more downstream, right? Is your problem something more like, emotional regulation? Sorry. And then furthermore, we can like tunnel down, right? Is it suppression, avoidance, or reappraisal? Which strategy do you use? Is your problem irritability? Or is your problem developmental in nature? Is the problem that you have a bunch of shame? Is the problem that you're lonely, right? Is the problem the way that you interact with people? So discordant relationships. Is your problem that you are still bullied, either by people at work or things like that? Is your problem that you lack professional or academic success? And this is what I mean by there's a lack of diagnostic sophistication. So I can diagnose someone with ADHD and depression, and I can give them treatment, right? I can give them medications or do CBT or whatever. But in my experience of working with actual human beings, if you really want to conquer this, it actually starts with this degree of diagnostic sophistication. So for you to look at yourself and say like, okay, which one of these things really fits me? Because each of these is going to have a different kind of like solution, right? So let's kind of go through those. So like if your problem is reward circuitry, like maybe what you need to do is a dopamine detox. If your problem is orbitofrontal control, maybe what you need to do is meditate. If your problem is amygdala hyperreactivity, maybe what you need to do is alter your diet for a certain neurotransmitter production, or be careful about toxic influences, or do a grounding meditation. Because there's meditation specificity all throughout here as well. Okay, maybe your problem is emotional regulation. So then this is where like you can do things like, CBT or other kinds of exercises to like move between these different areas, right? So CBT can teach you how to, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, can teach you how to do reappraisal. Increasing awareness of avoidance. So I know it sounds kind of interesting, but if you just become aware of your avoidance, that can actually move you into engaging in suppression. So just awareness is actually sufficient at starting the process of going from avoidance to suppression. Irritability, once again, there are dietary changes here. So there's evidence that, for example, altering the diet of people with severe autism to have high iron diets and address nutritional deficiencies actually reduces the amount of like meltdowns that they have. I know it's crazy, but people have actually done studies on severe autism, and what they realized is that because some of these poor kids, like they're just medicated through the roof to keep them like docile. And it turns out that there are dietary changes that you can make that will actually alter your irritability. There's a bunch of stuff about this in Dr. K's guide about sort of theories around how altering your diet affects neurotransmitter production, right? So produces serotonin, like gives you precursors that will be produced, turned into dopamine, serotonin, etc., things like that. If your problem is shame or loneliness, so for shame, like maybe you need to go to therapy, and this kind of therapy may be different. It's more processing therapy, right? If you're lonely, this is where like potentially coaching could come in. Like, sure, you could go to the therapy route and talk about how you're lonely, but maybe by working with a coach, you can actually focus on solutions to make friends, right? Like, how can I understand, like, okay, where can I go? How do I meet people? How do I go outside? We had that post recently. So there are a lot of different solutions with loneliness that may not necessarily be sitting in your therapist's office and like talking about how lonely you are. Like, I know it's crazy. As a therapist, sometimes I do not think that is the cure to loneliness. And now discordant relationships. This one is huge because once you are aware, right? So here's my experience with the majority of people I work with ADHD. When it comes to this, they have no idea what they're doing. Like they have no idea that the reason their relationships are discordant is because they are inattentive, is because they are impulsive, that other people have difficulty keeping up with them. All they conclude is people don't like me. It's hard for me to keep friends. I don't get invited to stuff. And then that just turns into shame, right? So like then they start to develop an identity of themselves that I am unlikable. People don't want to be my friend. It's not anything in their control. It's just like I am this way and I'm screwed. And so it leads to shame. And the more ashamed you are and the more you come to realize that people don't want to be your friend, you're not even going to engage in relationships. And then you don't try to engage in relationships, and then you end up being lonely. So by understanding the nature of your discordant relationships, you can even prep people. So sometimes I'll even like prep my patients about how to talk to people and say things like, hey, by the way, I've got ADHD. So like there are all kinds of things that my patients oftentimes do. So for example, they'll be late to social engagements. They'll be, they'll sometimes even forget, like they won't keep track of like the fact that they were supposed to meet someone for lunch. And so obviously like that person is pissed. And so interestingly enough, just raising awareness of your, inattentiveness, raising awareness of your disorganization, and raising awareness of your impulsivity can actually start to mend your relationships. Like you can just form healthier relationships once you understand all these things. The bullying, you can teach people how to set good boundaries. And the professional or academic success, there's a lot of stuff here, but there's dealing with the shame to begin with, because that's like a burden on you that prevents you from succeeding. You have a sense of identity as a failure, so you can work on that, right? Maybe therapy, maybe coaching, something like that. And then you can also do like actual treatment interventions. Like maybe you do need like ADHD meds. Maybe you do need cognitive behavioral therapy for ADHD, right? And the point here is that the roadmap for your progress and for you to put together your life is absolutely there. But it starts by sort of having a sophistication of diagnosis. What is my actual problem here? Which of these boxes do I check? So you can kind of go down this list, right? And you can kind of say like, okay, oh, this feels right. This feels not right. Actually, like, I'm not getting bullied. It's not a big deal. Like, oh yeah, like my big problems are professional or academic success, feeling of shame, and then like, I'm very, very avoidant, right? It's not so much that I'm irritable. Like, I don't get pissed easily. I actually do have good friends. I've got a good social support structure, so I'm not lonely or this. And so it's very specific in terms of how to navigate it. And once again, despite the fact that, like, you know, the last thing that I kind of want to share with y'all is, despite the fact that a lot of this stuff is genetic and neuroscientific in nature, there's still a lot you can do about it. Like, this is not, you know, there's a lot of stuff on the intervention side that can be done. And generally speaking, my approach as a clinician, and this is what, you know, it's not just as a clinician, this is what we also do in coaching, is to like help people understand where is your actual problem. And awareness of the problem can, in my opinion, not even doing anything about it, just recognizing what the problem is can account for a 50% improvement in whatever you're talking about. So just to give you guys like a simple epidemiological example of this. So if you look at like obesity in Central America, so obesity in Central America is really, really bad. And it's probably due to the propagation of like sugary beverages. Like, and people down there, like, I think that's changing now, but, you know, 20 or 30 years ago, like people like in some parts of Central America, there was just a lack of education that like drinking, you know, like sugary juices and sugary sodas, like 3 meals a day is going to contribute to obesity. And once people just realize, oh, hey, what I am putting into my body may affect, you know, like my health. Once that awareness is there, it actually results in like a positive change in behavior. And so if you look at things like socioeconomic status and obesity, what you tend to find is that there are parts of the, you know, parts of the world where they're like, there's a very low understanding of like the impact of like what you put into your body and how it affects your health. And you can go to places like Whole Foods and stuff like that, where there are all these wellness magazines. There's a lot of food there that's unhealthy, by the way. But you can see that even awareness can account for some amount of change. And even from video games, we kind of know, like, if you don't know why you're losing a game, you can't even begin to improve it. If you're just aware of particular mechanics, right? Like, being aware of those mechanics will automatically change the way that you play the game. And so I think awareness, in my opinion, is actually worth 50% of the progress. And then once you have a specific problem, or once you figure out what your specific problem is, where your specific vulnerability is, you can start to make changes in that particular direction to sort of overcome this issue. A couple of things which I should sort of say if it hasn't become clear. I think if this stuff resonates with y'all, the first thing you should do, if you haven't done it already, is seek an actual mental health professional's help. So if you're concerned you may have ADHD, if you're concerned you may have depression, go and talk to an actual doctor or like therapist or something. So I know a lot of times we'll talk about things like Dr. K's guide and coaching and all that kind of stuff. I really do think the single most important intervention you can do is to actually go see a mental health professional. Beyond that, there are other things that you can do. Like, by all means, go watch Dr. K's guide. There's a lot of stuff in there about meditation and these different grounding meditations versus like the meditations that will teach you control. By all means, check out our YouTube video on dopamine detox. If you want to talk about this kind of stuff and focus on solutions to make friends and things like that, that's something that coaches may be better trained at. You know, helping you with professional and academic success, that may be something that coaches can help you with. You know, helping with discordant relationships, that can be therapy or coaching. But really at the top of the list is, if you guys have not seen a mental health professional, you should absolutely go do that. Questions? Or I guess let me just kind of summarize. So just to kind of recap, today we talked a little bit about ADHD and depression. And the goal of what I was trying to do today is to stitch together a lot of different disciplines of science to give us a very clear understanding of what ADHD and depression, like how they interact and what they are. So it starts with genetics, where we sort of discovered that 70% of ADHD and depression appears to be, has a 70% concordance in genetics, that there are a lot of scary statistics that show that ADHD and depression may start at the genetic level. So once we understood the genetics, we kind of went into neuroscience and tried to figure out, okay, what's happening in the brain of people with ADHD and depression? How do these two things kind of interact? Then what we did is looked at deficits, right? So once we understand what's happening in the brain, what does that manifest as within an individual? What are the actual deficits that someone with ADHD and depression has? Once we understood what the deficits are, we sort of were able to take a developmental perspective. So if you take a kid who has these kinds of deficits and sort of has ADHD as a child, how does growing up with those deficits manifest as depression when you're an adult? And we kind of explored those things. And what do the statistics tell us? What does the research tell us? Are the contributing, or what are the smoking guns of depression in adulthood for people who have ADHD? And we discovered that it's discordant relationships, bullying, academic hardship, emotional dysregulation, and irritability. And then we even looked at sort of a more present-focused or clinical-focused perspective, where we kind of said, okay, so like once you're here and you're in the here and now, you grew up with ADHD, now you have depression, what does that look like in the here and now? What are the different strategies that people use in the present to deal with their emotions? And then finally, once we understood that, what is our roadmap for improvement? If you fall into this bucket, what do you actually end up, like what can you do about it? And the answer is you can do a lot. So you're not doomed by your genetics, you're not doomed by your brain. There's a ton of stuff that you can do. And I've worked very successfully with like tons of patients that have been able to essentially overcome ADHD and depression. So there's hope out there, don't give up. And I really hope that today's lecture has empowered y'all to better understand this really fascinating aspect of like human neuroscience, human psychology, and like sort of the experiences of these people in the present. Questions? All right, questions. Okay, I'm going to focus on questions relating to ADHD and depression for now. How does strengthening the frontal lobe affect stuff? Okay, good question. So let's kind of go back. So, how does strengthening the frontal lobe affect stuff? So remember that our motivation, behavioral drives, and essentially what we do, our reward circuitry, is the nucleus accumbens. Now, in the nucleus accumbens, let's kind of go down here, okay? So let's look at point number 7. How does frontal lobe affect things? So in our nucleus accumbens, there's like a pro and a con for a behavior, okay? And essentially what happens is like our emotions may be telling us break up with this person. And our frontal lobes may be telling us, oh, no, don't do that. Don't give in to the emotion. So there's a tension between emotions and frontal lobes in the nucleus accumbens. And depending on which one wins, if the frontal lobe wins, then like you'll engage in one behavior. And if the emotions win, you'll engage in another behavior. It even goes a little bit deeper because the reward structure can be related to emotions or frontal lobe. And so what that even means is that, how can I say this? Let's say I'm bullying someone. The amount of satisfaction I get from bullying someone relates to the emotional impact on our nucleus accumbens versus our frontal lobes. Which is why we'll see, like, if you look at people who are lifelong meditators, they don't engage in, like, toxic behavior because it feels less rewarding to them. This is how, like, people who meditate on a regular basis, like, become better human beings. I know it's kind of bizarre because it's not just the influence of, like, you know, what you end up doing. It's also the reward that you get from, like, giving into your emotions. So, like, giving into hatred is going to reinforce your behavior in a particular way and is going to feel really, really good if your brain is, like, framed a particular way. When you strengthen your frontal lobes, literally the satisfaction that you get from being a toxic asshole on the internet goes down. And so then we see a reduction in that behavior because your reward circuitry has been altered. Does that make sense? So you mentioned genetics, but are you familiar with the science behind epigenetics in regards to this, specifically the studies about things like PTSD being passed down to children through epigenetics? Yeah, I'm pretty familiar with that research, so let's take the question from the top. So there's some evidence. Okay, let's just really go from the top. So the first thing is that there's a field called epigenetics, which is not the actual genes, but how genes are turned on or turned off. So our genome, like we've got a bunch of stuff in there, and it's not necessarily the allele or like the gene, like the DNA sequence at a particular point, but like you can turn genes on and you can turn genes off. That's called epigenetics. So whether genes are turned on or off actually relates to our experiences. So certain kinds of genes will be turned on by certain kinds of experiences. So an example of this is when our body gets an infection, we will activate transcription. We will turn on genes of things like heat shock proteins and other kinds of like genes in our cells that will help us fight infection, right? So it's like there's a bunch of stuff that like once we get infected, our body's like, time to go to war. Let's start producing, like let's turn on our armories and start producing soldiers and like, you know, cytokines that will help us fight infection. So experiences can affect our genetic activation. And so if we go back to what I was saying earlier about what is the model of genes, right? So that's where I sort of shared that genetics plus vulnerability is what results in illness. And all that kind of stuff is epigenetic. So this is also where when we kind of look at that developmental aspect, when we were talking about, okay, if you have a kid with ADHD who grows up with an ADHD brain and experiences life as a kid with ADHD with bullying and not having friends and like poor academic success, that's going to have an epigenetic impact and make you vulnerable to depression. So I believe a lot of that stuff is mediated through epigenetics. I personally have not looked into the epigenetics of development with ADHD as it relates to depression. But I sort of feel like I don't need to because there's like, I mean, hopefully I made a convincing argument of this. I think we have enough pieces of the puzzle where we're like pretty sure that that's happening. Great question, though. Yeah, so can you explain more how to work on discordant relationships? Sure. So the term discordant relationship means like a relationship that has discord, right? It's something that's not working properly. So if you want to work on discordant relationships as someone with ADHD, I think the main thing to understand is what are your ADHD deficits that could impact the relationship. That's the first thing you got to do. So is this relationship not going well because I'm disorganized and I like don't show up when I'm supposed to show up? Is this relationship not going well because I was supposed to pick someone up at the airport and I showed up an hour late because I'm disorganized? Like that's a very practical example of how disorganization in ADHD negatively affects the relationship. Is this relationship being negatively affected because I'm inattentive? So when I do hang out with someone, I'm literally not able to attend to like what they're saying. So we're going to dinner together and like I'm going to dinner with, let's say, my partner, right? So my romantic partner, and they've had a bad day and my mind is like wandering all over the place. So then that partner will feel unheard. They'll feel like someone's not listening to them. They won't feel emotionally supported and it'll create discord in the relationship. So the first thing to do, or maybe it's like irritability or emotional regulation, right? So maybe the reason that my relationship is in discord is because I'm too irritable. I've had a bad day and then I like go and meet my friends. And since I'm in a foul mood because I'm overly irritable, like I snap at them and they feel hurt. And then like I feel like I screwed up, right? And then the avoidance kicks in because we know that people with ADHD engage in avoidance behaviors. And so once I create a problem in a relationship, since I rely on avoidance, I never really fix it, right? I never talk to them about it. I never apologize to them. Or I overly apologize and never engage in discussion. I never ask them, hey, what was it like to have me being like irritable that day, right? I never want to hear from them how I'm like actually sometimes not a great friend. So I avoid. So like that's an example of like looking at not only the predispositions you have to damage relationships, but then also your coping mechanisms can sort of reinforce that damage or interfere with your repair mechanisms because you're so avoidant. And that leads to discordant relationships. So how do you work on it, right? So now this is where we kind of look at, for example, like if you know that what your problems are, you can actually have conversations with people about them, right? You can say, hey, by the way, so like, let's say you go to dinner with your partner and they're talking about things and you can even like, while you're tuned in, you can say, hey, I can see that this is something that's really upsetting you and I'm having a lot of trouble focusing on what you're saying. And what I really want to do more than anything else is focus on what you're saying. So I'm going to do my best, but I apologize if it seems like I'm kind of checked out. I'm really trying to pay attention. The second thing that you can do is even suggest an alternative. And you can say, hey, like, it's really hard for me to like pay attention to you, like being in this crowded restaurant. Is it okay if we table this conversation? Let's go for a walk after we're done with dinner. And like, I'd love to hear about it. Maybe we can go for a walk. Because oftentimes what people with ADHD discover is that having some kind of physical activity helps them pay attention. So I've written notes for students of mine for them to be able to knit during class. Okay, so this is a really interesting thing, that if people with ADHD are able to knit, they can actually pay better attention mentally. So I'll even have patients who will be like, hey, I'm going to stop eating. This is the extreme. I don't think this has ever happened. I'm going to stop eating, and because this conversation is so important to me, I'm going to pull out my knitting because that helps me pay attention. It's bizarre, right? So then you can start to address things. You can also signal to other people, because remember that if they don't know what's going on internally, they're going to interpret your inattentiveness is a lack of caring. So you can have a conversation with them where you can help people understand, hey, it's not that I don't care, it's that I really do care and my brain is really not complying right now, right? So you can sort of address things. And then the third thing, which I think is really, really important to improve discordant relationships, is to move away from avoidance. If there is some kind of conflict, if there is some kind of problem, and you feel really ashamed or whatever, like, you can't bury it, right? Or I guess you can suppress. That's what I mean by bury. So that kind of suppression is actually healthy. So burying it and attending to them, but avoiding the situation, never having a conversation with them, never acknowledging things, pretending that everything is okay, or devaluing things in my mind. Oh, my partner will be fine. It's like not that big of a deal. Like, they understand I've got ADHD. I don't need to talk to them about it. All of those kinds of avoidance strategies will cause discord in your relationship. So move from those strategies to more suppression, where you're like, even though it's really going to hurt me to have this conversation because my partner may confirm my deepest fears, that I'm actually not a good partner at times, I still have to have the conversation. I'm going to squash that feeling down and sit down and actually have the conversation. And ideally, you can even get to the point of reappraisal, where you can work through things on your own and you can say, like, I really care about this relationship. And even though it may be hurtful to get confirmation that I didn't do a great job, in the long term, moving past that is the right move and really what this relationship needs. So I have to do it because caring about the relationship and my value for the relationship is greater than my feelings being hurt temporarily. That's sort of the ultimate fix. So I hope that helps. Okay, so one person is saying, I've tried to get diagnosed for ADHD and have been told because I'm depressed and my age, it would be inconclusive and I'm unable to get treatment for what can I do? So I'd say go see a different clinician. So let's understand a couple of things. So ADHD, oftentimes people will get tested for ADHD. So there are neuropsychological tests. So you go to a psychologist and they will administer like a test of your attention. Based on the results of that test, they can diagnose you with ADHD or not diagnose you with ADHD. But the truth is that a test cannot diagnose you with ADHD. All a test can do is give you a probability of what your diagnosis of ADHD is, if that sort of makes sense. Because that's how psychological tests are designed. A true diagnosis of ADHD is often done clinically, and a test is used to supplement a clinical diagnosis. And so what does that mean, a clinical diagnosis? That means that you sit down with a trained professional who evaluates you and essentially subjectively decides. I know it's kind of objective, but it's really one person's opinion, because that's how we do psychiatric diagnoses. There are no objective tests for psychiatric diagnoses. So a trained clinician has to sit down, evaluate your symptoms, and say, yes, according to my expertise, you have ADHD, or according to my expertise, you do not have ADHD. So that's ultimately where the diagnosis of ADHD comes from. It doesn't technically come from a test. Even the test report will not give you 100% likelihood that you have ADHD. If you actually read the report, it'll probably say, and I could be wrong, there may be a test out there that, because I'm not a neuropsychologist. So, I could be mistaken there. But based on, as a psychiatrist, when I refer people to neuropsychological testing, they'll give me a report back. And that report will say, like, we believe that this person has a high likelihood or extremely high likelihood of having ADHD. Here are the neuroscientific deficits that we believe that this person has, which is why we think they have ADHD. So they go into a lot of detail, but they're never going to give you 100%. So just talk to a clinician. Now, the main confounding factor is that if you have active depression, so if your cognition is being affected by your depression, then it makes it very hard to determine whether your inattention is coming from the depression or coming from the ADHD, if that sort of makes sense. Because we know that people who are actively depressed have trouble paying attention to things. But that has nothing to do with ADHD. That's because attention is, a complicated circuit in the brain that can be affected by mood, that can be affected by depression. So the real way you should make a diagnosis of ADHD with someone who's got a diagnosis of depression is ideally to treat the depression, have the depression in remission, right? So then they're not actively depressed anymore, and then evaluate their attentive when their depression is theoretically out of the picture. And if they still have attentional problems, then there's a good likelihood that they've got ADHD. Now, as a clinician, I've diagnosed people with ADHD despite the fact that they're actively depressed, and that simply comes from asking questions about what their attention was like before they were depressed, right? So you can still do that. You can still try to do an assessment of, like, before depression ever manifested, what was school like for you? Did you ever need special testing? Did you have difficulty with this? Did you have difficulty with that? Sometimes I'll talk to their parents, and you can still sort of like make a preliminary diagnosis of ADHD, even in the case of active depression. And that's very important clinically. So I'd say find a good clinician, because a good clinician should be able to suss that out for you and walk you through, maybe treating your depression so that you can get a good diagnosis. But I'm not surprised that one person would say, hey, we can't give you neuropsychological testing while you're actively depressed because that'll interfere with the test results. That sort of makes sense. Okay, just so y'all know, I know I'm getting a lot of questions and responses and stuff. I'm still on the first round of questions, okay? So I think I can scroll down quite a bit. Someone saying, Dr. K, listening to your voice empowers me. Good, I'm happy to hear that. I'd also hope that listening to my words empowers you. Oh boy. Adventurer 467 says, I'm late. Oh, dude. My poor friend. If you came in late to this lecture, it's going to be tough, dude. Go back and watch from the beginning. Okay, why do people have ADHD? What a good question. This is actually really interesting. Why do people have ADHD? So it is my belief that ADHD, why do people have ADHD? If we want to understand why human beings have things, I think the best the best answer for the question why is evolution. So as a psychiatrist, medical professional, scientist, call me whatever you want to. I think if you really want to understand why, you could turn to things like religion or yoga or whatever, right? And I've studied all that stuff. I believe in some of that stuff. But in terms of what I'm confident, sharing with y'all, it's basically evolution. So if you look at human beings, everything we have, things that, don't exist probably had selection pressures against them. And things that do exist have selection pressures for them. So for example, people may ask the question, why do we get depressed? And there's a good video about this in Dr. K's guide. Depression is the price we pay for the evolutionary advantage of self-awareness. So if we think about human beings, at some point we became self-aware. And it turns out that from an evolutionary standpoint, the capacity for self-reflection gave us such a dominating advantage over every other species in the planet. The problem is that when we gain self-awareness, we open ourselves up to depression. And that has to do with this circuit called the default mode network. There's a big thing about that in Dr. K's guide. I go into all that detail. So let's talk about ADHD. Why would we have ADHD if it's a disease, right? Whereas I think you have to, and there's a good theory about this, which is sort of the hunter versus farmer theory, which is that when human beings were 10,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago, human beings had different temperaments. So some human beings were very routine oriented, like to wake up at the same time every day, like to go to the same place every day and do the same stuff every day. So these people became the farmers. And there were other human beings that hated being a farmer. They wanted variety, and they wanted to like go out and explore, and they needed to attend to a lot of stimuli. So when I'm walking through the jungle, my brain needs to be like bouncing all over the place. It needs to kind of be ADHD. It can't just focus on one tree. It has to look at this tree and has to look at the ground. Is there a snake over there? Is that like a footprint over there? Is that a broken branch over there? And so there's almost like this adaptive benefit to having a mind that's attention is more loose and not focused and not repetitive. And so early on in human, like in societies, like we had hunter-gatherer societies, we had early farming societies and things like that. And there was probably a selection pressure for both. So the most successful tribe was one that had some farmers, some people who were into routine, and some people who were like very dynamic and had attention all over the place. So essentially what happened is like, that's why we see in society, we have both camps, right? We have the people whose attention is all over the place. These are the vatas, for lack of a better term. And then we also have the kaphas. These are the farmers, the people who are very routine oriented. The reason that ADHD is now a disorder is because of a couple of things. But the first and biggest reason is because our society has a very, very farmer bent. So like hunters like don't do well in our society anymore. If we think about school, for example, school is like 8 hours a day, the same crap all day, every day. It's not being out in the woods. It's not learning with your hands. It's not using your hands, right? It's not being a tradesman anymore or tradeswoman. It's all about like schools and books and learning and 9 to 5 and the grind and stuff like that. So that benefits the farmers. It's a farmer-like society. As a result, now this thing which used to be an evolutionary advantage when we were hunter-gatherers has now become a disorder because we're not able to function in this society with brains like this. So that's my big answer to why is there ADHD. It's because these brains no longer fit with the society that we have. There are also other influences, like we know that, for example, early exposure to technology, and especially like short-form technology, reduces our attention span and makes like it hard for us to like retain attention on one area. So it's not just a societal influence. There can also be like technological influences where there are even studies that have been done on long form television versus short form television. So if you take a kid and you give them long form TV, like you have them watch a movie, that's not going to negatively affect their attention span. Whereas if you have a kid who's watching 30-second clips on YouTube for like 6 hours a day, their attention span is going to be like really, really short, right? So they'll still be very dynamic. They can juggle a lot of things, but their ability to sit through school is not going to be like, it's going to be hard. It's hard for them to sit down and focus their attention. So there do appear to be societal influences that are like more developmental and related to technology too, which is why ADHD I think is getting worse, actually. So that's why we have ADHD. Okay. Oh man, what are the comorbidities of other conditions that also match ADHD symptoms? Dude, that's a whole lecture in and of itself. But the short answer is that's why we have the process of differential diagnosis. So remember that, ADHD is a collection of symptoms, like impulsivity, for example, inattention, irritability. If we look at the differential diagnosis for those symptoms, there's like a ton of stuff, right? So PTSD is the great chameleon of mental illnesses and can masquerade as pretty much anything. Bipolar disorder, depression there's a subtype of depression called depression with anger attacks, which is like a pitta depression, which we also talk about in Dr. K's guide. So that's where like people who are depressed aren't sad, they just get super irritable. So even depression can manifest as like irritability and inattention. Bipolar disorder for sure, if you're manic, right? So, or hypomanic, you're more irritable, you're less attentive, you have flight of ideas. So bipolar disorder can manifest that as substance use is very high on the list of like on the differential, right? Because if I'm like high on Adderall or I've had too much coffee, I'm going to be speaking very fast, my mind is all over the place, and I'm going to be irritable. So the differential diagnosis is huge. If you want I guess we could theoretically do whole lectures about differential diagnosis, but that's when we're really like talking medical school kind of stuff. Like, so that's what I teach clinically. Like when I have a resident who's like a psychiatrist or a medical student who wants to learn about psychiatry, like that's the kind of detail that we go into there. Good question though. Seems like defective executive function would be a disadvantage in tribes. I would think so. So I think like executive function is like the most OP thing in the brain, in my opinion. So I don't know why we would have a deficit for executive function. If we look at it evolutionarily, probably the reason that we have deficits in executive function is because of opportunity cost. So if you kind of think about it, I know this sounds kind of weird, but what do you think is like evolutionarily advantageous? Being very like stable and monogamous and staying in one relationship for your entire life that is like harmonious, where you raise 2 kids and you make sure that you can like support them with resources, or being somewhat of an emotional train wreck and having like lots of different children with like lots of different people. What's actually like evolutionary advantageous, right? Like falling in love and then having a train wreck of a relationship. If that happens like 6 times over the course of 15 years, it's interesting, right? So like evolutionary advantages are about survival and reproduction. By the way, I'm not sure that that's the case. So I literally do not know, because it may be that, that person's offspring are like less likely to have successful offspring of their own. Like you never know. So it's interesting, but yeah, we don't really know why people seem to have executive function deficits, but it may be because like if your executive function is too high, like you're less likely to have children. Who knows? Okay. Uh, so would you have any recommendation for ADHDers with depression who are currently unable to access medication due to waiting lists? Any supplementation or specific meditation techniques you'd recommend? So I'd go back to the roadmap, right? So I gave y'all like lots of different things to work on. As far as supplementation goes, I'm not going to recommend any supplements. Generally speaking, we try to steer clear of that here at HG. I mean, we do it in Dr. K's guide because I think there's a lot of backstory before like you understand, like you think about taking a supplement. So in Dr. K's guide, we go into a lot of detail about the dangers of herbal supplements. We also want to do a very thorough like review of the literature and the science before we recommend anything. So there are particular things that we'll talk about for depression and anxiety, but it needs to have like, a lot of safety discussions, a lot of like exploration of the real efficacy of supplementation. So while there are things that I do for my patients, and that's basically a Vata balancing diet is what I would recommend, there's a lot of backstory to that and a lot of complicated stuff that you need to do before I just say, hey, do this. So I think one of the unfortunately irresponsible things that tends to happen is people will talk a lot about supplements, but they won't have, in my opinion, the boring, safe conversations that you really need to before you get into supplementation. As far as specific meditation techniques, I think I addressed that in the roadmap as well. So we've taught some techniques for restraining attention, like the rotating sound awareness meditation. And by the way, the guide now has a meditation index where you can now search based on like, if you're looking for grounding techniques and things like that, it'll like point them out to you. But I think that depending on going back to the roadmap, once you figure out what your problem is, there are specific meditations for like each of those problems. So if your problem is shame, for example, you may want to do like some kind of Anahat chakra or metta meditation. These are heart chakra meditations that are all about cultivating compassion and forgiveness. That's going to be different from the meditation that helps you restrain your attention and focus on one point. That in turn is going to be different from the kind of meditation that you use to ground yourself when you're emotionally activated and like very irritable, right? So there are all these different meditation techniques. There really isn't great science yet that specific meditation techniques target things at the resolution that I teach, because you just have to do a ton of clinical trials. I think we'll get there. We're getting there. But clinically, I found it to be very effective to teach people specific targeted meditation techniques. But those techniques depend on, the roadmap. So one person is saying, great, so ADHD is good for nothing now? I disagree. So I'm pretty sure that if you look at successful streamers and content creators, the prevalence of ADHD within content creators is higher than the average population. I think as our society is becoming more ADHD with shorter form content and things like that, right? So like it's like the ADHD brain. Who did we have? That guy who has so first of all, if you go back through our interviews, like we have a bunch of like streamers and content creators who like will say, yeah, I have ADHD. Daily Dose of the Internet. So I think that's a guy, I think if I remember correctly, he sort of said like, I have really bad ADHD. And if you kind of think about it, what is he doing? Like he instinctively knows because of his ADHD what he finds entertaining. So he uses his ADHD as almost like a compass to determine like what's getting included in Daily Dose of the Internet and what isn't. And it's very successful. Right? So we've also got people are mentioning Mizkif and XQC and stuff like that. So like, yeah, I mean, check out the Mizkif interview if y'all are curious. That's an excellent interview about ADHD. But I do think that it's, ADHD has advantages. Like once it crosses the threshold of disorder, it's the reason we define it as a disorder is like because it's negatively impacts your function. So if you've got super bad, ADHD, chances are it's just like it's a negative, right? But that's why I also prefer to sort of use the Ayurvedic system because I am quite ADHD, but I'm like subclinical. So I think Vata is a better example of like how to understand the spectrum, the bell curve of like attention across human beings. Okay. Is becoming apathetic to your successes whilst obsessing over your failures common with ADHD? I'm going to say yes. So let's go back to the neuroscience. So remember that, oh man, this is so complicated. Let me just think about this. Okay. So the question is becoming apathetic to your successes whilst obsessing over your failures common with ADHD? And I'm going to say yes. So let's lean a little bit on what we've learned today, okay? And maybe y'all can walk through this with me. So first thing is obsessing over your failures common with ADHD. Let's unpack that phrase. So the first thing is obsessing. So one of the hallmarks of ADHD is dysregulated attention. So a lot of times people assume that ADHD means a very small attention span. But the truth is, if you talk to people with ADHD, what you find is dysregulated attention. And what that means is that sometimes their attention is very, very small, but the flip is also true where sometimes they get so deeply absorbed in something where like everything around them ceases to exist. So this is a disorder of attention. Instead of your attention staying kind of in the middle where you can get distracted when you need to get distracted, but you can focus when you need to focus, what you'll see oftentimes in ADHD is a hyper focus to the impairment of their life. So I get so caught up in a video game that I lose all track of time. I get so obsessive about something that I stop paying attention to everything around me. So obsession is actually like a very interesting hallmark of ADHD and something that leads to a misdiagnosis. Because what you'll find is sometimes people will be like, parents will think about their kids and they're like, well, my kid sometimes has paying attention, but then once he starts playing Legos, it's clear that Legos can hold his attention for 3 hours at a stretch without any interruption. So that must not be ADHD because he's sitting there, he's playing with the Legos at 3 hours a stretch. That can actually be a feature of ADHD. So it's disordered attention. Okay. The second thing is, so that's the obsession. So the second thing is obsessing over failures. So remember, we talked a little bit about how the volume of the amygdala and the insula in people with ADHD is smaller. The interesting thing is that volume loss correlates with worsening symptoms of depression. So it appears that the brains of people with ADHD are actually more vulnerable to negative emotions, right? Which is why they're prone to depression. So obsessing over your failures is completely consistent with our understanding of ADHD. Now, being apathetic to your successes has two elements. One that I've sort of already talked a little bit about, and the second one that's kind of new. So the first is being apathetic to your successes is likely an avoidance strategy to help emotionally regulate yourself. So remember that people with ADHD have difficulties with emotional regulation. And so their inability to regulate their emotions results in three coping strategies: avoidance, suppression, or reappraisal. Avoidance is when we kind of mentally check out from the thing. We either avoid the situation entirely, we literally don't go, so we can physically check out of the situation, or what we'll do is mentally check out of the situation. So we'll even go to the place, but we'll devalue something in my mind so that I don't have to be hurt by it, right? So I kind of go AFK in a situation. That's absolutely a tactic used to overcome my disordered emotions to begin with. It's a coping mechanism. So healthier than that is suppression, where at least I feel the emotion, but I push it down. So there's internal conflict versus mentally checking out. And then the third and healthiest thing is reappraisal, which is when I kind of work through the emotion and I end up like looking at the silver lining or realizing that, okay, even though even though my partner dumped me, like in the grand scheme of things, like there are other people out there, I learned a lot from the relationship. I'm going to know better what mistakes not to make next time. That's an example of reappraisal. So we can see how apathy to success absolutely falls into that avoidance category as a coping strategy against your difficult emotional regulation, which we once again know that people with ADHD have. So that's consistent, apathetic with success. The last thing that I'll mention, which is a little bit different, which is a little bit more from the yogic perspective or the Eastern perspective, is when you're a child with ADHD and it's hard for you to succeed because you have certain neurological disadvantages in terms of like attention and things like that. One of the things that you have to learn how to do is divorce yourself from success. And this is a protective mechanism. So I want you to put yourself in the shoes of like a 12-year-old who has difficulty studying. And so if I have difficulty studying and I'm afraid I'm going to do bad on the test, what I have to learn how to do is numb myself, right? Because if I'm invested in success and I have ADHD and then I go and fail the test, I get punished, right? Because I wanted to succeed. And so I try really hard and then I end up failing anyway because I have ADHD. It's not my fault. I spent 8 hours in front of a book, but my brain wouldn't focus. And so that hurts so much. So what do I learn how to do? I become psychologically calloused. I learn how to numb myself. I learn how to be apathetic to my success. Because the cool thing is that if I become apathetic to my success, I also, in a sense, become apathetic to my failure, right? Because if I divorce myself, it's like, I don't care about the test, whatever, whether I succeed or fail, whatever. And so it sort of becomes a short-term coping strategy, which doesn't really work because, as you kind of mentioned, you do still obsess over your failures, right? But that's because your brain is vulnerable to the negative emotion. So despite the fact that you're numbing yourself to the success and the failure, if you've got a brain that's more vulnerable to the negative emotion, what you kind of end up with is I'm numbing both equally, but I'm hypersensitive due to my small volume of insula and amygdala to the failure. So even though I'm numbing both equally, I have an amplification of the negative emotion due to the way that my limbic system is wired, right? And so that's sort of like, it's like actually a perfect example of everything that we understand from neuroscience, everything that we understand from development, why people with ADHD are apathetic to their successes and obsess over their failures. And hopefully if you watch that whole lecture, you'll be able to follow that and you'll be able to arrive at that conclusion as well. So people are asking about gender differences between male and female ADHD. So the biggest difference is that men seem to be more vulnerable to ADHD than women. I don't have the exact statistics, but I think some of that also has to do with maturation of the frontal lobe. So girls tend to have slightly more mature frontal lobes than boys do. So at the end, when everyone's fully grown, it all evens out. But generally speaking, like sometimes girls will have, be like developmentally 1 to 2 years, or boys will be like 1 to 2 years behind, or girls will be like 1 to 2 years ahead. So that's pretty common. A lot of that has to do with frontal lobes, and ADHD does appear to be more common in men than women. would you argue, oh man, it's so hard because everything I say, you guys, so I'm like responding to questions from like 10 minutes ago or comments, which is hard. I have to figure out how to handle that. Would you argue that adults, teenagers these days have a harder time to cope with ADHD due to technology because the human brain wasn't prepared for the advancement compared to older generations? Absolutely. So, you know, if we look at older generations, oftentimes, like, I don't mean to speak poorly of them, but like the boomer generation, right? Which it's not all boomers, but some of them tend to be very not sympathetic towards the mental health plights of like the digital generation, right? So the pre-digital generation is like, I don't understand why y'all are all so messed up. Back in my day, I had to walk 10 miles through the snow to get a glass of milk or whatever, right? They'll look at their world and then compare their world to our world. And when they compare their world to our world, what they'll do is they'll look at a lot of the advantages that we have now, which they didn't have back then, which are fair, right? So, for example, like food security, I'm pretty sure is better now than it was 100 years ago. You know, infant mortality is better now than it was 100 years ago. You know, the likelihood of like dying from cholera is like way better now than it was 100 years ago. Society has advanced. Society has become more convenient. You used to have to go to a restaurant if you wanted to eat food at a restaurant, like from a restaurant, right? Now we have a bunch of people that deliver. You can get groceries delivered. You can get food delivered. You can get all kinds of stuff delivered. You can go to school online. Our life has a bunch of convenience, right? So there used to be a certain kind of hardship 100 years ago that we don't experience. There are objective, life has gotten, by a lot of objective measures like mortality and life expectancy and things like that, better than it was 100 years ago. So, the pre-digital generation looks at us and they say, things are so much better. And they point to all these things and they say, like, why are you so mentally unhealthy? Like, why do you have ADHD? Why can't you just study? Why are you depressed? Why do you have anxiety? I think the things that they don't look at, they take some things for granted because they really don't have any awareness of like what it's like to grow up in these conditions, right? So they see they see some changes which are very external, but what the pre-digital generation doesn't understand is like the internal stresses that growing up in this digital world sends us. So ADHD is a good example of like, if we look at content, right? Like first there was YouTube, and sorry if I'm like historically inaccurate. Then there was Twitch, and if we kind of look at the dynamicness of content, like YouTube used to be like, still like it's a storehouse of content. You kind of pick what you watch. You're not missing anything because it's going to be up there forever. And then that sort of evolves into Twitch, right? And like Twitch is like more interactive. It's more temporary. So you got to kind of be there. It's a little bit more ADHD. And then like that evolves into TikTok, which is like the whole point of TikTok is that it's super short, right? We also have evolutions from text messaging to things like Snapchat. And I'm still not 100% sure about this, but my understanding about Snapchat is that it's like, the whole idea is that the messages are temporary. So if you don't check it frequently, like it disappears into the ether. So if we look at the way that technology is advancing, it's selecting for and entraining, conditioning a shorter attention span. And so that's one of the reasons why I think that ADHD is getting worse. But technology is also having effects on things like depression and anxiety. So when we get bombarded with the worst news from all over the world every single day, we begin to see the world as falling apart. As we see the world as falling apart, we start to feel depressed and hopeless. Because how can I fix climate change? I can't. Might as well sit at home and do nothing, right? How can I fix all of this, like, racial hatred? I can't. Might as well sit down and do nothing. How can I fix all of these like income inequality? Like I can't fix it. I'm powerless. So when you get bombarded with this sensory information and you feel powerless, and then like the internet gives you this sweet, sweet TikTok, right? It's like, don't worry, man. It's okay. Like, don't worry about climate change. Here, watch this TikTok about climate change, which will like engage your emotions and make you feel self-righteous and will help you feel better. And after you watch that TikTok about climate change, why don't you check out this one about cats? Because cats are hilarious. Don't you love cats? And so that's what happens, right? We have like this world that bombards us with all this depressing information, and then it gives us it creates this problem, and then it gives us this solution. And we take the solution, our brain loves the solution, and then we end up trapped in this cycle of like, being emotionally like pulled around like a puppet on strings. And we get like emotionally like existentially depressed, and then we get like coping strategies. It's not even a coping strategy, it's an addiction, really. It's like, we'll fix that for you. Oh, like you're in withdrawal from heroin? Like, here, have some more heroin. That's essentially what like is happening on the internet right now. Is that it's like addicting us to heroin by giving us all this negative emotion. And then it's like, here, I've got the solution for you right here. Right? And so like, yeah, I think that this is a societal thing. It's a technological thing. In the pre-digital generation, I don't think understands that. Right? And so this is even funny. We even have a word for it, right? So like the internet has collectively realized that this is going on. So we developed our own language of copium. That's like literally like we created a word to describe this phenomenon because it's happening and it's so prevalent. It's crazy. Right? Like even look at the icon. Like look at this picture of this Pepe with his eyes closed he can't even, you guys understand, he's got a mask on because he can't even bring himself to hold it to his face. He is so AFK from the world that it needs to be strapped onto him in order for him to get that copium. He can't even be bothered to get up out of his chair and like walk over to the copium machine and like take a hit of copium. He just sticks it on and can't even keep his eyes. He just got to AFK completely. You guys get that? It's like actually like in the image. I mean, it's a beautiful image. Like art is like a fantastic way to capture what is happening in society. Right? So you guys think that like I'm good at analyzing society and psychology, but like I'm a fraction of what a brilliant artist is capable of. Because here I am, I've been lecturing now for the better part of, it's 2 hours, holy. And an artist will capture it like this, whoever made this captured it in like 300 pixels. It's brilliant. Right? They've taken Pepe and they've just given Pepe different facial expressions. And they've encapsulated so much. It's also interesting because, I remember learning in history class that hieroglyphics were a primitive language and that the alphabet is a superior language, right? Because the alphabet allows us to, construct words and things like that. You only need to learn 26 characters. And now it's like we've like swung through alphabet and into emojis. And so we've come full circle back to hieroglyphics. Where now like people don't even communicate. And once again, it was like writing letters used to be inferior to having a phone call. And now we've come full circle and we're like back to texting is our primary form of communication. And it's like we're coming full circle. And they've understood this in like East Asia for a long time, right? So they have like Chinese characters and kanji, which are essentially like hieroglyphics. And so it's just interesting that a lot of our understanding of like language was like actually kind of Eurocentric in terms of its, a value system that I don't think was actually accurate. Right? Moon roots, yeah. Okay. So, I guess I was planning on doing more stuff today, but it turns out that the lecture lasted longer. It is complicated, and we did a bunch of questions. So I think we're going to have to try to do the rest of it next time. I think we've got an interview on Friday. Let's try to... man, I gotta meditate. I don't think I can talk, though. Let me think. Yeah, chat, I think I'm too wiped to meditate. These, it's so hard to meditate when I just talk, like lecture for 2 hours. But let me think if there's something I can do. Okay, so yeah, we can do a meditation. Let's do it. Let me just drink some water. Okay, so I'm just trying to think a little bit about... So I'm going to try to do a meditation that works on this principle of moving from avoidance to suppression. Okay? So first time I'm doing this. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to ask you guys, I'm going to make a series of statements, and I'm going to try to provoke emotion. Okay? And by provoking emotion, I want you guys to start practicing, step into the sandbox of your mind and start practicing dealing with that emotion. So oftentimes when we experience negative emotions, our response is going to be to try to avoid the situation, right? We don't want to go anywhere near it. We're going to try to mentally convince ourselves that it's not a problem. That's a cognitive avoidance. Or there can even be a physical avoidance where I'm literally not going to engage or see the person or situation that causes me emotional pain. Oddly enough, one step forward from that is suppression. And so suppression is about acknowledging the emotion and fighting with it. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to make some statements that will hopefully evoke some emotion. And by evoking emotion, what I want you guys to do is notice what your mind wants to do in response to the emotion. Notice that it may want to engage with the emotion. So it may start thinking lots of thoughts that get you like more engaged in the emotion. It may start to distract you or move away from other things or something, like move towards other things, move away from certain things. So you may want to indulge it. You may want to avoid it, depending on what kind of emotion I evoke. And then what I want you to do is just notice your mind's reaction. And instead of giving into whatever it is, try to hold the emotion in your mind and almost work at it directly. It's even okay to push it down or fight with it, but don't indulge it. And hopefully y'all will understand once I kind of give you guys examples, okay? So I'm going to say a series of statements. So what we're going to do is sit up straight, close your eyes. So your spine should be straight, your back should be straight. Take a moment to breathe. Just notice your breathing. So we'll do a little bit of box breathing. So what box breathing is inhalation for 4 seconds, holding breath for 4 seconds, exhaling for 4 seconds, and holding breath for 4 seconds. So we're almost making a box with our respiratory cycle, okay? So breathe in for 4, hold, exhale, hold, inhale, hold, exhale, hold, and now for 5, breathe in, hold for 5 seconds, exhale, and hold for 5 seconds. Inhale for 5. Hold for 5. Exhale for 5. And hold for 5. And now let your breathing naturally resume. Notice the natural slowing of the breath. And now what I'm going to try to do is make some statements that will hopefully provoke some kind of emotional response. Dota is a superior game to LoL. It has greater strategic depth. LoL is a superior game to Dota. It requires more skill. Black lives matter. All lives matter. Notice what kind of reaction those statements make. You are a wonderful person. You deserve so much more than what you have in life. I'm so proud of you. You're a terrible person. Everything wrong that's happened in your life is your fault. You don't deserve forgiveness. You do deserve forgiveness. Even if it's your fault, you still deserve forgiveness. You do deserve love. You are lovable. You are unlovable. You are broken on the inside. You can pretend as much as you want to, but you will never be fixed. You are broken on the inside. And that's okay. You don't need to be fixed. You can be loved in spite of being broken. I accept you despite you being broken. Hey.
You okay?
Meditating.
Oh, shit. We're waiting for you.
Oh. Okay. Okay. So as we were using those statements, I want you to just take a moment and notice the emotional reactions. Notice how within you, something floated to the surface with some of those statements. Right? Something within you arose and wanted to either accept or reject what I said. And notice how your emotional reaction is completely artificial. I do not mean any of the things that I said. They're simply words. They're vibrations traveling through your headphones or your speakers across the internet. They're just constellations of vibration and energy that hit your eardrums. And based on that, your emotions awaken. Notice how you're pulled to the left and pulled to the right, pulled all over the place, based on the responses that arise from within. And although they feel real, and in a sense they are real, they're completely artificial. And notice your tendency to indulge them, whether that's getting angry, whether that's fighting against it, arguing, proving me wrong, or giving in to the hurt that was brought up, and agreeing. And notice that with these artificial words, I can create an emotional response. And that emotional response creates further emotional or cognitive ripples. And how easy it is to get caught up in all of this stuff. And now, as best as you can, step away from it even through this process of listening to my words, perhaps you've stepped away a little bit already. And now take a moment to appreciate, to realize that this is a skill, that this can be done, that no matter what is said to you, no matter what kinds of emotions arise within you, that you exert some degree of control. That the fundamental ability to step away from how you react and how your reactions control your behaviors can be overcome through practice, awareness, and dedication. You can be free from your emotional reactions. Now take a deep breath in. And as you exhale, slowly open your eyes. What about hypersensitive people, though? Yeah, that's exactly what we're talking about. Hypersensitivity just means a stronger emotional response or difficulty reining in that response, right? But this is the perfect meditation for hypersensitive people. Perfect. Train that skill. What is hypersensitivity? It's either feeling more emotion or being more controlled by your reaction to the emotion, right? It's letting the emotion control you. That's what hypersensitivity is. Okay, so who are we rating, chat? I apparently have a meeting, I guess. Oh, shit. Wow, they booked it right after stream. Okay. I really do have to go. You guys want to raid Arteezy? Is he streaming? You can raid Artur. Raided someone small. Arteezy not even streaming. Pokey? Okay, Pokemon's live. All right, let's raid Pokemon. Okay, we'll see y'all on Friday. Hopefully we'll have an interview scheduled. So enough of the teaching. I'm ready to interact with another human being. And if we don't have an interview scheduled, we've got a lot of good stuff from Reddit. So send Pokey some TLC and have a good day.